Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 111. Language is so much a part of our lives that we don't give it much thought. Even if you've grown up multilingual, it's unlikely that you've taken the time to think about how the languages in your repertoire differ from one another. This is one of the reasons that we encourage children to study a foreign language at some point in their education. It's not just so they can take a trip to Spain someday, or visit a great aunt in Provence. Study a language, any language, and you'll immediately realize that the world is bigger and more complex than you imagined. In our last podcast, we started to examine the issues that translators confront as they go from one language to another. We're interested in this matter because it's at the heart of Bible translation. Today, we're going to continue this topic by exploring the ways in which languages differ from one another as they achieve the same goal: clear and precise communication. Let's use an example sentence to illustrate this principle. George gave the apples from his tree to Susie. If you're a native English speaker, this makes perfect sense. George is the one performing an action, in this case giving something away. He's giving 2 or more apples. Those apples originated from a tree that he owns. Susie, the recipient of the apples, benefits from George's action. How do we know all those things? The sentence's word order helps a lot. George comes first and Susie last. The action lies between them, so there's a certain inherent logic in the sequence. There are also a number of helper words in the sentence. The word from indicates that we're about to discover the origin of the apples. The word his tells us who owns the tree. English is what is called an analytic language. These rely heavily on word order and helper words to achieve clarity and precision. You can't rearrange the sentence or leave out the helper words and expect it to make much sense. For example, if it said, George, Susie, apple, tree, give, you'd have no idea what was going on. You could make some guesses, but there's no way you could be certain. Some languages, however, organize their sentences in exactly this way, and they make perfect sense. How do they do this? One way is to use what are called inflections to clue the listener into the correct meaning. Inflections are changes in the word's form, adding a special prefix or suffix, for example. Those changes follow very specific rules. Once you've learned the rules, the words can be in almost any order and they'll still make sense because the inflections tell you each word's role in the sentence. Languages that primarily rely on inflections are called synthetic languages. Some take this tactic to great extremes. When you're studying one of these, you have to learn to conjugate verbs, memorize cases, use declensions, and remember a noun's gender. English uses inflections too, but they're fairly few and rather basic. Let's go back to our example sentence. George gave the apples from his tree to Susie. This sentence contains 2 inflections. First, the verb gave is a modification of the verb to give. Changing the verb's form tells us that the action happened in the past. Secondly, the S on the end of the word apple tells us that there's more than one, but that's pretty lightweight inflection as languages go. If you've ever studied Latin or Russian, you know that they're heavily inflected. This is one of the reasons that English speakers find Latin difficult to learn. It uses a significantly different approach than English does. Some of Latin's linguistic descendants, such as Spanish, Portuguese, and French, are inflected too, but to a lesser degree. For this reason, they're easier for an English speaker to learn. Languages can include both synthetic and analytic elements. Linguists classify them by their dominant tendency, whether they're primarily synthetic or analytic. A linguist would tell you that English is mostly analytic. Over time, languages can change the methodologies that they use. In the early Middle Ages, English was much more inflected than it is today. It therefore drifted from synthetic toward analytic. Biblical Hebrew did the same thing as it changed into modern Hebrew. In ancient times, it was more inflected than it is now. The great truth about languages is that they never stand still. We've just skimmed the surface of language complexity, and I've simplified it more than a bit to keep this podcast from getting too long. But I think you've gotten the point that languages use some pretty diverse strategies to achieve the same goal. This is the main reason that translation requires a lot more than converting the words from one language to another. God's solution to the Tower of Babel was pretty thorough. Now, let's explore a related issue that's especially relevant to translation. We'll phrase it as a question. Are some languages more capable than others for expressing certain ideas? In other words, are there sophisticated and unsophisticated languages? Based on your experience at learning another language, you might be inclined to say yes. If you've struggled through Russian with all of its inflections, you might suspect that it's more complex than, say, French. But this is a bit of an illusion. What you've really discovered is that French is closer to English in the way that it works than Russian is. That's the real source of your difficulty. Back in the 19th century, when modern linguistics was finding its feet, linguists began to study the languages of people living in the more remote parts of the world. Many expected those cultures to have primitive languages that couldn't communicate sophisticated concepts. At heart, this idea had an evolutionary worldview behind it, plus a healthy dose of arrogance. What the linguists actually discovered surprised them. There was no such thing as a primitive language. Instead, the peoples they encountered could express with clarity and precision any idea that they understood. While they didn't have the vocabulary to discuss things they didn't have, such as industrial technology, they could develop workarounds to those problems fairly easily. These studies revealed a fundamental principle of linguistics. All languages are equally capable. At this point, I see a hand raised in the back of the class. You're probably wondering how this could be true, since some languages seem to go out of their way to communicate with great precision. Most people think of the highly inflected languages, such as Classical Latin or Classical Greek, as in this category. It's certainly true that the highly inflected languages have a great deal of precision built into the language's structure. Communicating a detailed idea is quite easy with these languages. Get the inflections right and you're good to go. Does this mean that you can't translate from one of these languages into one less inflected without losing precision? Not a bit. And this leads us to another important principle of linguistics. Languages tend to lean either toward precision or convenience. What does this mean? It's simple. A language can build a lot of precision into its basic structure. This tends to make its rules very detailed and complicated. It's harder for people to learn it if it's not their native tongue. Essentially, you're trading convenience for a compact, precise structure. Some languages go the other way. They opt for a relatively small set of rules without a lot of complicated structure. These languages are convenient and somewhat easier for a non-native speaker to learn. But the language doesn't have precision built in. When it's required, you have to add it yourself by using more words. You'll get there in the end, but you'll have to work a little harder. It's 6 of one, half dozen of another. At the end of the day, however, all languages can achieve whatever precision is required to communicate the idea. If a human mind can understand something, that same mind can express itself in whatever language that person uses. God has made all humans capable of high-level communication, regardless of their culture or technological sophistication. And while some languages are harder for non-native speakers to learn, everyone learns his or her mother tongue with equal ease. That's another important principle of linguistics. Humans are born language-oriented. You may be wondering how a culture without sophisticated technology could talk about something technological. That too is easy because it's just vocabulary, the simplest part of language. If people need to discuss something new to their world, they just invent a new word or borrow one from another culture. The word computer in its current sense entered the modern world through English. Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, Russian, Japanese, and Korean all more or less adopted the word without change. If you hear someone speaking one of those languages and the word computer comes up, you'll recognize it easily. But Iceland didn't want to go that route. Its culture generally resists borrowed words, so in 1965 the Icelandic language police decided to make up a new word for computer. The word they accepted, tölva, is a combination of two existing Icelandic words, number and prophetess or oracle. The Icelandic word for computer, therefore, literally means number prophetess or number oracle. As I've said, language is versatile. And that brings us to a final important question that people sometimes ask. Did God have to use Greek to deliver the New Testament? Some people hold this view because Greek is at the precision end of the language spectrum. They reason that God used a precision language because the ideas of the New Testament require precision. A language such as Aramaic, which is closer to the convenience end of the scale, just wouldn't have worked. Unfortunately, this idea isn't linguistically sound. As linguists have discovered, humans can communicate effectively in any language. God could have used Aramaic to deliver the New Testament, just as he used Hebrew and Aramaic to deliver the Old Testament. It might have required the writers to jump through a few more linguistic hoops to get there, but they would have managed. In fact, if you think of it, some of the New Testament was originally delivered in Aramaic. Jesus and his disciples, being Jewish, would have spoken Aramaic amongst themselves. When Jesus addressed the crowds, the audience was mainly Jewish. Again, he probably would have used Aramaic. Yet, his disciples understood all of the detailed ideas that he was communicating. Aramaic was just fine. But when the time came to write it all down, they used Greek. In a sense, they were performing a mental translation, taking concepts originally received in Aramaic and writing them down in Greek. Conclusion? God could have used any language available in the first century to deliver the New Testament. The final length of the book and the language structure would have been different, but his word would be there in all of its perfection and detail. Why did he choose Greek then? I think there's an alternative explanation that reveals a deeper truth. Let's consider the history of the Bible. When God spoke to his people Israel in Old Testament times, he used Hebrew, the main language of that audience. After the Babylonian captivity, when fewer spoke Hebrew, he switched to Aramaic for the final Old Testament books. Since the New Testament era includes the church, which reaches out to the whole world, God delivered the New Testament in a language accessible to the entire Roman world, Greek. Something else is worth noting, too. At the time the New Testament was being written, the Old Testament was already available in Greek. Conclusion? God wants his word in the optimal language for the current audience. That's why we must translate the Bible. Languages are moving targets, so the Bible must be regularly retranslated so it remains accessible to as many people as possible. Having brought my topic back to the subject of translation, I close for the day. Next time, we're going to look at the first translation of the New Testament, what we now call the Old Latin Bible. As the language of late antiquity shifted, the Bible followed through translation. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.